Today's topic, evolutionary origins of human morality, is presented by Professor Mike Grant. He's a retired professor emeritus from CU Boulder in biology. That's his specialty. Evolutionary, maybe it wasn't, but was it evolutionary biology? Close enough. All right, Mike, I'm going to let you talk now, and thank you all for coming. It's a really good turnout. I'm glad everyone could make it. Mike.
Oh, thank you, Conrad. Can you hear me okay back over in this corner? Okay. I have 2 or 3 different settings that I can use, and this seems to be about right for this group. So again, I thank you for taking this beautiful day and coming inside and listening to an old professor yak, yak, yak. So I appreciate that very much. The topic is one that almost all of us spend a fair amount of time thinking about, reading about, maybe writing about, and so forth. And that's the general concept of what's right and what's wrong. And that can be in all kinds of contexts, as you know, when you're raising children or when you're going to a community meeting or whatever it might be. And almost all of us, most of the people that I have met, and I think it's generally true, have the notion that morality and ethical values are entirely external. They come from the church, they come from your parents, they come from your neighbors, they come from all external onto the individual. What I'm going to try to do today is present some evidence and some data. I'm a scientist, and so I like to have data as much as I can to point out that a significant fraction of what we think of as morality, as ethics, as right and wrong, is in your genes. That it has an evolutionary heritage, an evolutionary understanding, and an evolutionary explanation. I do not in any way denigrate and not minimize the environmental contributions. They're very important, they're vastly important, but they're not exclusive. And that's sort of the general framework that I want to talk about today. In one of this is expressed historically in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people, and one of the most common one is the Jiminy Cricket sitting on your shoulder and saying, "Don't do that, don't do that," to let your conscience be your guide. Now, that can easily be interpreted. What is conscience? Where does conscience come from? And that's part of what I'm going to try to talk about today. I am very happy to answer questions, to be interrupted, to argue, to say, "You sure got that wrong." That's okay. Let's talk about it. So don't feel like you need to just, as one of the consultations I did on a teaching thing, I counseled the instructor. I said, "You're acting as if your students are a fresco. I'd rather have some interaction. The frescoes don't do very much, and you may not either, and that's okay. You're not obligated, but I invite you." Okay. Morality turns out to be a very challenging concept to try to hem up and pin down without leaking out to the sides. Philosophers have worked on it and had some pretty different outcomes of what morality might be. So I'm going to take a pragmatic approach and say that part of what we think of as being a moral person, engaging in acts that are moral, is that one of those is helping others. That is, almost all societies support the notion of helping someone else if they need it. If they're in the pool and about to drown, you try to help them out. If they're in danger from something, you try to warn them about that danger. And that's generally a part of moral and ethical values in almost all societies. There are exceptions, but very few. And the other one here is the concept of social equality. That can be said several different ways. It can be said each individual is important. Each individual counts. That there are rankings of most important person, next most important person, and people that don't count, that are ranked. Now, we do have a number of institutions in our history who have taken that object and done it that way, and we could sure talk about that a bit. But I'm going to argue that this concept of social equality is part of what I think of as a moral compass. That's not all, but it's a part. Okay, I'll review just briefly this. Where do we get our ethical beliefs? And most Americans, there's a number of polls and questionnaires that say this. Most U.S. citizens argue that it comes from Christian doctrine, from the Holy Bible, though now it used to be the King James Bible, now there's a bunch of different versions of it, but it's still that basic notion of a sacred text from which right and wrong is expounded. And so that's the dominant way. Now, others will be a little more broadly and say it comes from religion in general. So not only do we have Christian religion, but we have Islam and a whole series of other religions. And together, religions is what defines and tells us what's right and wrong. One of the interesting things I ran across here was that 71% of people polled said that they adopted the values, the morality of their parents. 71%. So that probably means that you guys are mostly in the 29% group, because you probably did not exactly agree with your parents on some of the big issues of right and wrong and morality. And other places, which certainly play an important role, is just your general community, where you play baseball, basketball, whether you go to book club, potlucks, or whatever it might be. Other family members besides your parents, churches, of course. And then there's always this typically called school of hard knocks. You learn by experience that that was the wrong thing to do in this particular circumstance. So those are the typical sources of moral beliefs that most of us in America hold. I'm going to focus on these elements, not a comprehensive view of morality, but certain elements that I can talk about in a reasonable way. One is a sense of fairness. Most of us have an internal sense we want to be a fair person, whether we're on a jury to be a juror, or whether we want to divide up some limited resource. We have a sense of fairness that is, we consider that a positive, a moral good. And so one of the complaints that we oftentimes hear as a criticism is that's not fair, because we have that sense of fairness. The other thing that I'm going to talk about a fair amount is reciprocity. That's back and forth. I give to you, you give to me, or I hurt you, you hurt me. Reciprocity is back and forth, and I'm going to talk about that a fair amount. Now, one of the ancient kinds of moral state is called in our society the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And that's true unless you don't like what the other person does. And so there's some other formulations that work a little bit better than that, but that's back for thousands of years. That's been in various codes to do that. And empathy is a very important part, in my view, of morality, that you must have some sense of empathy for those that you're connected with, you're working on, or you're talking to, or you're working with, or you're trying to teach, whatever it might be. Is the more empathy, I know that you're feeling lousy today, and so I'm going to take that into account. I know you're angry. How do I know that? Because I have some empathy, and you're giving me signals that I can empathize with to do it. And then the last of these is altruism. Altruism is the concept that you incur deliberately a cost. It might be a financial cost, it might be an emotional cost, it might be a physical cost of some sort, in order to give a gain, a positive, to someone else. And that's altruistic behavior. When you spend yours in favor of others, that's altruism. And that also is generally considered a part of morality. And we often condemn extreme selfishness, which is just the opposite of altruism. Now, as a scientist, I'm not quite Lord Kelvin, where if you haven't measured it, you don't know what you're talking about, but I'm over in that end of the spectrum a bit. So I'm going to talk about measurable elements of morality. What can we quantify? What can we measure? And see how that's done. And we're going to learn how to distinguish self from others. That is, I'm a person and I'm an individual, and I am not you, I'm not you, I'm not you, I'm my own. And that is a very important component of your genetic makeup, is to be able to recognize self. I think, therefore I am. I'm going to talk a bit about empathy and what's the evidence for empathy. Can we measure how much empathy? Is it absent? Is it present? Same thing with fairness. What's the sense of fairness you have? And fairness can be thought of in several ways, and I'll try to illustrate that more specifically. Consoling behavior. I'm so sorry you stubbed your toe. I'm sorry you took that drink of whiskey and it burned your throat. I am consoling you, and maybe it won't happen again. And then the last one, vengeance. Vengeance is very much in most religions. I'm going to have a very different take on vengeance than what religions have, but I think you'll find it pretty interesting. At least I hope you will. Okay. Here I'm going to have to get a little bit wonky, so hang with me. This wonkiness is, there's two categories of moral challenges. The first is me versus us. So what is good for me may not be good for us. What is good for us may not be good for me. So there can be oftentimes a tension between me and us. And we can think of that as a moral issue. If it's good for us and bad for me, and I agree to it, is that being moral? Or if it's bad for me, I don't agree to it, am I being moral and true to myself? So there's this tension that's going on. And what I'm going to show is that that kind of moral challenge, me versus of, evolution has solved. Evolution has solved that one. And I'll show you how to do it. And I'm going to give some particular examples about punishing cheats is a way to solve that circumstance.
Are you talking about the prisoner's dilemma?
I will talk about the prisoner's dilemma, yes, but I have not yet. But I will talk about the prisoner's dilemma. And this is more in the category of the tragedy of the commons situation. And the tragedy of the commons is a common sorry, is a frequently occurring situation where you have a community property and everybody, say it's a pasture, and everybody can put 2 cows, the pasture will support 2 cows, and Conrad puts 3 cows out because he makes more money, and everybody selfishly wants to put more in there until the whole thing is in trouble. And that's what the tragedy of the commons is about. And that's this, that we have, evolution has solved. Now, the second type of moral challenge is us versus them. That is, we're in a group versus that group that's out there. We are Republicans versus Democrats. We are Yankee fans versus Mets fans. We are Broncos fans versus, okay, lots of ways us versus them comes about. And the evolutionary environment has failed entirely to solve this problem. It is still with us. It's a very big feature of our society and operations, and I'm going to talk about it. We are still dominated by what are often called tribal gut reactions. And it's not your gut, it's your brain that's reacting, but that's the words we use anyway. And we tend to have a propensity to very quickly join into the in group. The ones we like, that's the in group. We join them quickly. We like them, we like the way they dress, like the way they talk, whatever it might be. And we're very quick to oppose the out group. We don't like the way they dress. I don't like the way they cut their hair. I don't like the speech pattern that they have. In group and out group. That's us versus them. And evolution has done a lousy job of trying to solve that as a moral issue for humans.
I I've got a question about the tragedy of commons. Is that distinctive from Kant's universalism?
From what kind of universalism?
I think it was Kant's universalism that,
Oh,
of course,
no,
implied into it.
Kant stuff, yes. That's very closely related. This is just a simple metaphor to try to understand that general notion of the universalism of people, that we should have some sense of fairness and equality.
Okay. So there are some distinctions between the philosophies, it sounds like.
That's the way I see it.
Okay, I hadn't heard that. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to give some current biological perspective that I think is relevant to the origins of morality. The origins means way back there, starting early. Okay, a little bit of evolutionary biology. This is not your family tree, grandfather, father, you. This is your family tree, where you got cousins, second cousins, first cousins, siblings, parents. It's a bush, not a single tree or single line. And going from a fish to a salamander to a cat to you as a human is not evolution. Evolution is like this. We have common ancestors, some of which led to fishes, and some led to amphibians, some led to mammals, some led to humans. So those are very different ways of looking at it. So I'm going to take a little time here, a little wonky with the human evolutionary tree. And it's much more branched and rich than most people appreciate. It is a shrub that has many branches. And most of the time in our history, there have been multiple hominid, that's our language, hominin species extant at the same time, multiple ones. And oftentimes, there in some cases, the parent species is still present while a new species has been formed. So over here, and I'm pretty sure you can't see this, but there's one lineage over here that is the Afarensis lineage. Can you see the red bars on that? And the blue bars are the Homo lineage, and they split off. And we have the time periods over here on this side, and I don't expect you can list. But the picture I want you to get is that there's lots of hominids, not just us. We tend to think that's it. And I'll share that with you in a little more detail. A little less detail, I want to say. As we go through time, there was several million years ago, there was led chimps. These are DNA sequences that are used partly to build this tree. That's what this little DNA symbol is for, and these are the components of the DNA: cytosine, guanine, adenine, thymine, the chemical basis for it. And this is a pretty important part. That red line there is there was interbreeding between the Neanderthals and the Homo lines. And that really made a difference, that nowadays we can actually see Neanderthal genes and in geographic locations, and that's really a pretty interesting difference that we didn't think was in the past. Did I skip one? Yeah, I did skip one. Here's more detail of the breeding that you can see. We've got here Denisovans, that's a cave in Siberia. With Eastern Neanderthal, Western Neanderthal, early human, and human. And there are connections between these two right here. There are connections between these two right here. And there's one more connection that I wanted to say.
Western Neanderthal with human.
Here it is, right here.
Yeah.
4, right across there. Western Neanderthal with human. And we can see those genes when we look at humans today. This is a photograph, undoctored. No, this is an artist concept of what a Denisovan looked like. And Denisovans are a small group that we can actually see out of northern Siberia, but we can see in other places. Okay, this is an imaginary experiment. A space alien comes and takes a look at the Earth. Every 10,000 years, checks back in. First time they came, the human population was less than 10 million. Their activities were hunter, gather, and some primitive tools. Comes back another 10,000 years, still 10 million. Another 10,000 years, still 10 million people. Come another 10,000 years, and in less than 7 billion most recent 10,000 year span, we have developed global industry, an economy, advanced technology, nuclear power, artificial intelligence, some human intelligence, extraterrestrial travel, large-scale institutions, democratic governance, dictatorships, widespread literacy, advanced scientific equipment, advanced art, and so forth. So it happened very quickly, and it's partly a function of the population size of humans. Okay, this is part of the origin foundation, is the structure of human population. Several of these hominid species that I just showed you that formed the tree, almost all extended groups of extended family with a few outsiders, very closely related genetically and very small, usually a few dozen at best. And they barely had existence enough to get enough to eat, to stay alive, to stay away from the predators. And so that made in-group cooperation vital. Remember, in-group is this powerful thing that I said evolution hasn't solved yet, but you see why it was so important. You got a small number of people, you're trying to fend off predators, you're trying to gather enough to eat, catch a few fish. In-group loyalty was extremely valued and selected for by natural selection. Those groups that did not have the strong in-group would have disappeared and gone extinct.
I have a question on that about yawning. Is that an evolutionary in-group kind of a?
I
know
give
that
up,
there's
is it?
mixed- exactly. I know that there's
They
mixed.
claim it's a physiological thing as best I know, but yawning, I doubt it, is an in-group out-group distinction, because as far as I know, all people yawn.
Well, I mean, in terms of it being quote unquote contagious. I had heard that maybe that
I don't
was-
think so. That's not something I know.
Okay, I've been curious for a while.
And the out-group competition is very powerful. Why would the out-group competition be so powerful? Because of limited resources. We need it for our family, and we have to keep it away from you and your family. So the in-group out-group clash was extremely powerful force in the evolution of humans because of the structure. And that's occurred not in several of the hominid species, not just Homo sapiens. Okay, us versus them. Tribalism is a powerful mental framework, and it's present today. And you don't have to search very hard to see where the tribalism comes in as we sort ourselves into this group or into that group. And it can be on religious grounds, we're Islam, or we're Christian, or we're the Broncos, or some other football team. We have group activities, we go bicycling together or hiking together. We have book groups, we have hiking groups. And it is the foundational historical outlook in our genes to want the in-group and to function in the in-group and to value as a moral good being part of an in-group. And of course, we have political tribes, and I probably don't need to spend very much time talking about that. And from my point of view, from a biological point of view, modern racism is a special case of in-group versus out-group tension, with skin colors simply being markers for out-group versus in-group. Your skin color is like mine, so we're an in-group. Your skin color is not like mine, so you're an out-group. And I will say, as an aside, there are no true races in humans. That's a cultural and artificial construct. It's a very powerful artificial construct, but it's not biologically based. Okay, now let's look at some of the group tensions, and we're going to use game theory to talk about it a little bit. Art and Bud committed a crime of some sort together, jointly. So they're a team, and they either need to cooperate with each other or not cooperate with each other. And I'm going to show you some examples of how the group tension, the within group would be Art and Bud, the out group would be the police, the judges, and whoever's running the system. Okay, if Art and Bud each keep quiet and don't tell on the others, don't snitch, don't rat, you know the phrases for that, then they each get 2 years in prison for whatever it was that they did. On the other hand, if Bud thinks selfishly, I'm really going to take care of myself and I'm not going to worry about him, I'm going to worry about me, and he confesses to the whatever it was they were arrested for, he only gets 1 year of prison, whereas Art gets 10 years. On the other hand, if Art confesses he defects from the in-group, then he gets 1 year and Bud gets 10. And if they both confess, then they each get 8 years. So that's not a good situation. So do you see the power of in-group cooperation, of don't snitch, of don't tattle, don't be a tattletale kind of thing. I'm not going to talk Omerta or whatever language you're thinking about to do that. And I find that really pretty interesting, and I'm going to show you a couple more here in just a minute. So this rational self-interest, individual philosophy always says defect. You're going to be better off if you confect. Well, that's not necessarily true, because if you're part of a group, then that what's good for you may be bad enough for the group that it makes it bad for you as well. That's where they get 8 years apiece. And so this is set up to highlight the tension between self-interest and group interest. And that's the one evolution has not solved. I'll remind you that. Okay, now I'm going to talk about, that's a newspaper phrase that never appears in Darwin. It never appears in any early evolutionary things that I have read, Nature read in Tooth and Claw. But it's present things as competition always. The predator, the prey, the limited resources, fight over the resources. And more recently, over the last decade or two in biology, we have come to recognize and realize there's a lot more cooperation than we appreciated to begin with, and I'm going to show you, I want to tell you about some of those. Now remember, cooperation with others is part of what we think of as being moral, is acting in a moral way. There's evidence for cooperation amongst creatures that swim, among creatures that fly, among creatures that walk. It's abundant. One of the things that I mentioned to you earlier was this empathy and consoling. Chimps will rush and console the loser of a fight. Not the winner, they go console the loser, even though they were not part of it to begin with. That's evidence of empathy. That's evidence of friendliness and of cooperation. This is an amazing man. I'm a scuba diver. I had a nice scuba dive trip to Grenada recently, and you see groupers, wrasse, those are fish, and eels, that's also a fish, though we don't think of it as one, it is. These have a multiple species, multiple groups get together as a team, and they go in and flush out prey that are hiding in the corals, for example, and behind the rocks, flush them out and collaboratively hunt and kill them, eat them. So that's the group together overriding the individual selfishness, but they all benefit from that sort of thing. Variegated fairy wrens, that's one species. Splendid fairy wrens is another species, and there are not very many of them. They're pretty scattered. So what they do is they recognize one another, they form stable partnerships, and defend jointly eucalyptus in their areas. Two different species. They defend against whatever might be doing it. Usually it's other birds that they may attack, hawks and things of that sort. But they form, different species form and cooperate. Cooperate, not compete. Well, most of you may have, many of you may have seen this, that mother hens get all excited if their chicks are in trouble. One of them got in a water bowl and can't get out or something of that sort. But they empathize. It means the chicken empathizes and recognizes discomfort in the other. Important piece, foundation. And rats. Rats love chocolate. I know some other species that love chocolate too. And they will give up a chocolate reward to rescue a fellow rat that has to be struggling to stay alive in a pool of water that's over their head. They can't stand up. They'll give their chocolate away if the experimenter then will rescue the rat. That's empathy, that's cooperation, and that's friendliness. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears and talk about another dimension. We have in many species a very deep-seated antipathy toward cheats. And I mentioned earlier the tragedy of the commons, and it's, if you cheat, then you're a transgressor of fair play. It's not fair to you have twice as many cows on the pasture as I have on the pasture, just because it's better for you individually. One of the common attributes is that punishment of cheats is, even if costly to the individual doing the punishing, will do it anyway. Not to punish is a moral failure. Not to punish is a moral failure. For this, the most extreme example that I could find, some of you might have known and experienced the gasoline shortages in the 70s, and most of you probably have not. But boy, if you saw a gas station that had any gasoline, you whipped in there as fast as you could to try to get a couple of gallons of gas when the boycott was on. In this particular case, there was this man was trying to butt in line, trying to get ahead of some other people. Another person got out of his car, went up and shot him dead. Said that'll teach him to try to butt in line. Of course, this guy went to prison for life and probably taught him he shouldn't have done that. But that's the most extreme example I could find about the antipathy towards cheats. Now, there's a lot of mathematical models, which I will not try to show today, but which I find very interesting, that show that the tragedy of the commons works only if strong punishment for cheaters. Just saying, don't do that, won't do it. Go to your room for an hour, that won't do it. There has to be strong punishment of cheaters in order to avoid the tragedy of the commons situation. That's where the group interest is predominant over the individual interest. And today, a number of hunter-gatherer societies that still live pretty much as humans have lived for thousands and thousands of years, they tend to be very, very egalitarian. They are very flat in social structure, no hierarchy of tribal chiefs and assistant chiefs and assistant chiefs and all of that kind of stuff like we have. They're all egalitarian, but they are violently egalitarian. That is, they will actually beat people to death if people try to cheat. Somebody goes and kills an animal that they're going to feed, and the hunter, it has to be self-effacing, say, oh, it was just an accident, I was really lucky, I'm not going to get a bigger piece, you get the bigger piece. Strictly egalitarian, but they do have that violent egalitarian option when they deem it is necessary. Okay, now I'm going to go some different kind of evidence with how strong this notion of an in-group and an out-group is. Again, I'll remind you that the in-group, out-group, evolution has not solved it. This is what I'm sort of emphasizing. So we can experimentally divide strangers into a couple of groups, and then we give some money to them, and it's up to them to allocate that money to members of the in-group and members of the out-group. And there were 13 options with different amounts of money given, and they were not given any instructions. They were just so to allocate this money. This is your in-group, this is your out-group, and allocate the money.
This was based in the U.S.
This is all in I think this is all in the U.S. This might well have been in England, but I'm 87.632% sure it's in the U.S. Okay, so this blue part is the in-group, and the non-colored is the out-group. So one allocation pattern was 7 for me in the in-group and 1 for me in the in group, 7 for me and 1 for you. This is a 8 for me, 3 for an out group. 9 for me, 5 for an out group. There's not the same amount of money in each one. 13 for me, 13 for the out group. 19 for me, 25 for the out group. Now stare at that and think about it a minute. If you had that money, what would you be choosing? That's the first question. Second question, what did the experiment show? This is where you're supposed to do a little work.
So these are all of the things, so rationally, you could get 19 just by giving 25 to the other people.
Exactly. So that's what you choose?
And these are 13 cases, is that what we're
Well,
looking
these are
at?
different
13,
experiments.
18 and 23.
You choose 18 and 23? Okay, good. Anybody else?
Well, if you had all of those,
They're
Available to
not
you
combined.
at
Don't
once?
try to put them together.
Okay.
Treat them each as separate, individual. Which one?
I'm thinking 8 and 3.
8 and 3. So you keep, in group should keep 8, give 3 to the out group.
Really, 19 and 25.
yeah.
19 and 25, why 19 and 25?
Because you both have the most.
You both get the most of this good stuff, whether it's money or
Mhm.
Yeah.
whatever it might be.
I think
Okay,
we'll get
that's
very
what this is
selfish.
testing. Overwhelmingly, I don't remember the number, but it's in the 90 percentile range. Multiple groups given this over and over in different groups and different things, choose this. They choose this, which gives them the least. Why? Well, there's 2 reasons that explanation. All of it goes to the in group. One of them's to my other member. And why not 19 and 25?
Because
What
they
would be
don't
the
want
answer?
the other people to have it.
That's right. We don't want the out group to live. I'd whole rather cheat both ourselves and the other out group than to listen.
Does that make sense?
Isn't that's a powerful thing. So where does the principle of fairness show up? Where would that be in this?
13 and 13.
Yeah, how about right there? 13 and 13. If this says that the selfishness of keeping it away from the out group overcomes and dominates the sense of fairness that we would like to cultivate. Okay, questions about that? Yes, sir.
Are the participants primed to think something about the out group, or is it
No,
just?
no, you're divided randomly into 2 groups. We're gonna toss a coin. Your head, tail, and then they're just separated and they're given this and they say allocate between your group and that group. Your
It's-
group and that group is
It's
the
just-
language they
it's
use. They don't
really
use
powerful.
in and out group language, because
That's the
that would be
foundation
bias in the experiment
All
a
of our
bit.
problems.
So those are your groups over here, the other groups over there. How do you divide 8 units? How do you divide, what is that, 25 and 19, about 44 units? How do you divide it? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it's saying that the tendency is very powerful because we don't have to have any reason to dislike this other group.
That's right, that's right. They have not, in one of the famous experiments, you remember the second grade teacher put blue collars and brown collars and said blue collars are really good and brown collars are really bad. You can't do that anymore, it's illegal. But she did that and that gave them a reason, but this was no reason at all. So we were trying to get that without it. Other questions about this? I think that's a very powerful experiment. 7 to 1. The fairness principle would say 12 or 13, but it's not. To maximize both at the far right would give the out group more than you, and we don't want that to happen. That's the in group identification, outweighs the fairness principle. Okay, this is so-called ultimate game. One player is given a sum of money to divide between him and one other player. The first player with the money makes an offer. Okay, I've got $30. I'm going to give Kim $10 and I'm going to keep 20. Kim can either accept or reject that offer knowing that I have $30. And if she accepts the 10, she gets the 10, I get the 20, and we go home. If she rejects the $10, they both go home without anything. They lose the whole 30. Why would you reject the second player? Why would she reject?
Because it ain't fair.
Doesn't seem fair.
Because what?
It
Doesn't-
ain't fair.
It ain't fair. You got 30, I want 15. Don't give me 10, don't give me 5. I'd rather have none, because you get none too. And this is a revenge notion on cheaters. She considers me a cheater because I'm not dividing fairly with her. And this happens very frequently, that they both go home without anything. Okay. I want to spend a little bit of time and talk about self-sacrificing behavior, altruistic behavior, where what you do costs you something and it gains another person something. There's some value there that you give up. And that's within a family, that's a very common thing. You'll oftentimes give, you need to, you can't,
Yeah, he's got it.
you got enough room
Just be
there?
careful of the cables
Okay,
there.
watch out.
Sorry. They're downstairs.
Okay, in almost every culture, family rates more than non-family. That is, I will, as a parent, eat a smaller portion of a limited food supply in order to give my son a larger portion. I will spend my time working and not playing in order to make enough money to buy groceries. Within family, almost all cultures value that sort of altruism, giving other family member something that cost me something. And I want to take a little bit to talk about mother and father comparisons. Where is that altruism in your experience strongest? Is it in the mothers, or is it in the fathers, or is there no difference? Why?
They make a bigger investment in reproduction.
That's one reason, a very important one.
Confidence of maternity?
That's the biggest reason. The mother knows whether she's the mother or not, and the dad hopes he knows. So that's a big difference right there. Okay, and it's also these within the family is because of degree of genetic relatedness. They sacrifice within a family because the family is genetically related to them much more than they are to a random stranger. And that's where this lies in, is degree of genetic relatedness. In the 50s, I knew John Maynard Smith quite well. I did some work with him at one point, and he was a student of J.B.S. Haldane. You've probably heard of Haldane. He's a pretty famous writer and various philosophers. And he said that, Haldane said that he was prepared to lay down his life for 8 cousins or 2 brothers, but not 1 brother and not 7 cousins. What's going on?
Total amount of genetic relatedness.
That's it exactly. In other words, with a brother, he shares half of his genes. But 2 brothers, then that's going to be equal. And the same thing goes if you divide it up into 8s. Genetic relatedness is where you sacrifice in your family and in other situations as well.
But if that is true, then sacrificing yourself for the whole human race.
Now, the genetic relatedness curve is fairly steep. So it's an asymptotic out here, so the relatedness is usually not enough to, we call them unrelated, that you have your own genome. But that certainly could be the case. It turns out not to be the case very far. After about 2nd cousins, it's a pretty trivial relatedness. It is true. And one of the things I always like to tell my students is we're all African Americans. Every one of us that lives in America, because that's of the relatedness, even though it's really weak that we talk about. Okay, this is a little bit more wonky. This is the formalisms that we use to calculate genetic relatedness and the degree to which things are altruistic or not. Hamilton was a biologist, and he's the one who developed this rule. It says if RB is greater than C, where B is the effect of the behavior on the reproductive success of the other. How many children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, that's reproductive success, because that's all evolution cares about, reproductive success. So whatever the behavior is, how much does it affect the others? C is the effect on your own. How much does it reduce your reproductive success? And R is the coefficient of relatedness. That's whether it's half or an eighth or a 16th or whatever it might be. And so when RB is greater than C, that the statistical association will perform the behavior and the genes of those people will be favored when that condition holds. The gain is greater than the cost is the way to think about it. And there's more mathematical formulations, but that's the basic idea. Okay, now let's talk about morality and non-human primates for a bit. Non-human primates, as Franz de Waal spent a nice book. It's a very interesting book if you're interested. It's called Primates and Philosophers. Some of you may recognize the various symbolism in the illustration that's on the cover of the book. And he argues about how morality evolves. So a good bit of what I'm telling you came out of this book, especially what I'm talking about now. The first requirement to be able to use this as a moral base is that the species has to recognize self and distinguish self from others. That is, if I'm in a fire and you're not, I need to be able to recognize that. If I'm in a fire and I think you're in the fire too when you're not, then the rules just don't work in that sort of a circumstance. Traditionally, that's been a mirror test. There's been a lot of criticism of the mirror test in the last 5 years or so, but to my knowledge, there hasn't been a better one that has come up than the mirror test, where they will, for example, with a pigeon, they'll put a little dot of red paint on the breast of the pigeon, and the pigeon looks in the mirror and then tries to pick it off in the right place, and various other techniques of that sort to recognize the self. And that is a development in humans. There is a point where they don't recognize self, and then they do begin to recognize self as they develop, human babies. Okay, let's talk about fairness. There's two kinds of tests that we're going to do in this. The equity test, where both chimpanzees have to do some work, and then they're given a reward. Now, there's a hierarchy of rewards on the chimp scale, just like there are on our, that grape is a high value reward. A cucumber is a pretty low value reward. A piece of spinach is the lowest value reward in the chimp range. And I have some empathy with that, by the way. So they do an equity test, and they do the work, and they're offered a low value for it. They both get a piece of spinach, let's say. Oftentimes they will not take the spinach, and in some cases they pick the spinach up and throw it back to the experimenter. You didn't give me enough. It's not fair. I did more work. You didn't give me enough fair. Now the inequity test is different. They do this work as usual, and then one they hand the chimp the grape, and the other they hand the chimp the spinach. And oftentimes the chimp that gets the grape will not take it because he sees, these are both right side to side, he sees the spinach being given. That's not fair, and so I'm not going to take that. I think that's a really powerful thing that goes against, it's an altruistic act, and it's a very powerful thing. And they have far fewer exchange. So they make a fairness assessment, chimps do. So that's part of their foundation. I mentioned earlier that they do have consoling behavior. When they get in a fight, the friends or relatives will embrace and groom the chimp that has lost the fight, that has been harmed. And it's a very common empathetic behavior. Moral behavior, I would argue. For example, chimps can't swim. That's kind of interesting. They're so athletic in many ways, they can't swim. But they have jumped into deep water to save an infant who fell into the pool. And in one case, the rescuer drowned, but the infant was saved. He grabbed the infant and held it up, and the others grabbed it, and he drowned. Now that's pretty altruistic. And there's a lot of other examples, but this is enough. Now I want to move to the topic about vengeance. And many of you that were raised in the church like I was, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I don't know whether any of you recall that or have had that, but I certainly had it a lot. And so it's the vengeance, we're putting it in the framework of punishing cheaters. And chimps who take food without doing their share get harassed, screamed, social isolation, stay away. They're being punished because they cheated. They didn't do their fair share of work. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about babies, human babies, very young babies. And I'm going to talk to you about babies at 3 months or less of age. We experiment on babies. Now, the techniques for that are really kind of interesting and took a long time to work out, but they seem to be reliable in the scientific sense of reproducible and paying. And so we're talking about 3 months old babies' behavior. What the short version is, and there's a lot of peripheral stuff that I'm not mentioning here, but the short version is that babies will look at something they find desirable much longer than they will look at something they find undesirable. So that's the basic metric that they're using. Normally they're sitting on their mother's lap or something of that sort. So that they have spent a huge amount of time on the design of the experiment and have now been able to verify that it works in the way it ought to work. Okay, one example is one puppet is trying to get a toy out of a box. The box is folded over and the puppet is trying to get it out, and it drops it, and he picks it up, and he tries to get it out. And the second puppet goes over and puts his hands over the top of it, box, so that he can't get it out. He interferes with getting it out. A third puppet comes and helps the first puppet get the toy out of the box. The babies stare at the third puppet a lot longer, and they ignore the second puppet. That was good. You helped. You assisted. And therefore, I find you desirable, and I'm going to look at you a long time. And in one particular instance, this wasn't usual, but the third puppet that did the helping whacked the second puppet on the head, the one that was interfering. We think, damn it, stop that. That's a moral value judgment at 3 months. They do not have Republican card carryings. They do not have Democratic card carryings. They do not have Christian religion. They do not have Islamic religion. They're 3 months old. This is intrinsic in their genes, this kind of behavior. Pardon my amateurish effort at illustration, but this is an animation in which the circle is trying to get up an incline. That's the goal. And this triangle is helping. He's behind him, helping him get up the incline. Okay? Here's the circle, still trying to get up the incline, but the square is interfering. The square is pushing him back down and not letting him climb up. These are 3-month-old babies we're talking about. The babies approve of the triangle as measured by their staring time. And they are quite disapproving of the rectangle. That's a moral judgment. That's a moral value, in my opinion. And if we put little eyes like I did there, that effect is enhanced. It's even stronger.
But they were still
The
images.
pattern is the same, yes.
That, it was still image then, not an animation of the.
No, there was an animation.
Oh, there was.
I would, the still image is my amateur
Yeah, okay.
effort at that.
Okay.
No, it was an animation. They try to go up and the
Yeah.
squirrel would push him down and he'd try to go up or he'd try to go up and he'd stop and the other would come and push him up. Okay? Okay, I'm going to argue that there are three major lines of evidence supporting a strong, innate, partial genetic basis to human virality. I am not saying it's all there by any means, but I'm saying there's enough we need to know about it. For example, in chimpanzees, they are self-aware, they have empathy, they have consoling behavior, fairness, and vengeance, just the same as we humans do. And these are coincidental moral judgments. Irrational human behavior and economic gains, where fairness gives way to in-group versus out-group, is pretty strong and amazing. And the punishment of cheaters is really a strong evidence. One of the things that I didn't put up here is there are computer simulations of running the tragedy of the common with various levels of punishment. So ranging from stand in the corner for 10 minutes to whack on the rump to beating up and to execution. And the stronger the punishment for the cheaters is, the more the tragedy of the commons is avoided. That is, the group cooperates effectively. And then the last one that I have is the value judgments by 3-month-old babies. And they go for cooperative versus uncooperative behavior. I think that's a moral issue myself.
Was there a group of chimpanzees that did display, it might have been gorillas, that displayed the in-group?
These were
out-group?
chimps.
The ones that, I'm thinking of a case where there was in-group, out-group behavior. The territory was kind of getting overrun, so they split into 2 groups and had a war. Was that chimps?
Oh, that's happened, I'm sure, over and over in chimps and in bonobos and
Okay.
in gorillas. And when you try to do territorial in it, you definitely get clashes.
Okay. But it's not the same as in-group, out-group and irrational human behavior, or it is that same?
It has a commonality of in-group and out-group because they're fighting for their territory. Each of them is fighting for their territory. But it need not necessarily be genetic relatedness, though that usually is a part of it because these populations tend to be small. Gorillas are few in number and so forth. So I'd say that was a part of it.
Interesting, thank you.
Thomas Jefferson, a few years ago, wrote this: man was destined for society. That's where we are now, and that's what evolution hasn't solved, is how to work in a large society. He was endowed with a sense of right and wrong. Well, I take that to mean that's the genetic basis that he recognized, that's intrinsic in human genes. And he says this sense is as much a part of nature as the sense of hearing, seeing, feeling. It's the true foundation of morality. I argue that it is a partial foundation, a foundation on which a lot of environmental influences are built to do that. And he emphasized that it may be strengthened by exercise as by any particular part of the body. Do you exercise your sense of morality, your sense of ethics, or do you just let it float along? And that's it. End of the slideshow. Okay,
Wow.
questions?
Is there a time reference to this? Like say the last 20, 50, 100, or 1,000 years?
For what
Has
particular?
it changed?
Has it changed in the last 20, 50, or 100,000 years?
Yeah. Or particularly maybe in the last 20, like
Not evolutionary
pre-MAGA
change.
and
No.
post-MAGA?
Evolutionary change only occurs across generations. So it has to be across generations for evolution to take place. So it would have to be at least in the last 60 years, 80 years. And I see no evidence that genetic change has taken place over the last 100 years or so on this dimension.
So-
Others it has, but not on this dimension.
So you think that these changes are embedded in the DNA?
Yes.
And is there any percentage of that that's just embedded in the culture?
Well, okay, that's a question I'd really like to answer. Said, as a scientist, I want to measure. And there has been no measurable that I've read any studies to measure the quantification here. So what I will say is that in traits that have been measured, for example, behavioral traits in identical twins were raised apart, that they were adopted as infants by different families, raised in different countries. The estimate of the commonality of those traits, like dress, hair color, profession, those kinds of things, is between 40 and 60%. So pretty big farm. Now, whether that's true of this, I don't know, but that's the best data we have on quantifying this kind of thing in human pet.
I mean, there's no doubt that there is a genetic component, because you look at the behavior of ants in colonies, and they follow that genetic.
But they're not human, so that doesn't count.
Right, but it shows the potential existence of this being a genetic.
Well, I think it counts as a lot more than a potential existence, is my view.
Yeah.
Yes, but I would quibble a little bit about your peripheral comment that it's obvious that there is a genetic thing, because the dominant view is that there's no genetic thing. The dominant view is all of your morality, all of your ethics comes from your teaching of your parents, your community, your church, those kinds of things that I named. That's what most people believe.
And most people believe
Most
there's a
people
sky
believe it,
daddy.
and you believe that that's false.
I believe that it's all environmental is false.
No, you believe that there is a genetic component.
I think there's a very strong case, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So
That's
I'm
what I've tried to
struggling-
present, yes.
I'm struggling with two things that could impact this, right? Because we talk about MAGA right now and all of that stuff that's going on, and things that can really impact it. And what I'm seeing is like the hierarchy of needs. If our basic needs are met, does that start to shift us a little bit more to thinking or moving away from in-group versus out-group? If we have our basic needs met, could we be more generous to another group? And the second thing that I wonder if this impacts it is just intelligence in general. Because I think everybody in this room gravitated towards, we all get more if we go all the way over to the right, right? But, and it just made more
If
sense,
there
it
isn't
was
enough,
logical.
it's more instinctive behavior now.
Right, so
Fighting for better.
I'm wondering if some of this stuff is hopefully starting to migrate, because we're having more of our basic needs met, that we're still kind of in the final throes of, I need to hold everything for myself.
Okay, I would agree with you that the context matters, and that subsistence existence is very common in the world,
Right.
but not very common in the United States. It's more common than we want it to be, by sure, but it's not the rule. The rule is most people have a bit of a shelter and have enough to eat, kind of thing. And that does make a big difference. That would be the minimizing the evolutionary advantage that you would have with these kinds of traits. So I think that's true, that it's minimizing it, and my goal is saying that this is what was said a long time ago, and it's ameliorating to some extent. But the other side of the coin, I would argue that the tendency to quickly join in groups and to oppose out groups is pretty much evident. I don't see it weakening at all.
Yeah, and it really needs to.
Well, that's where evolution is not solved it. It hasn't
Yeah,
solved this
right.
thing. It's only solved it for the individual. So I quite agree with you. Most of us would like to adopt this fairness principle, 13-13 instead of 19-25 even, 13-13 kind of stuff. But that's why we have arguments about morality and ethics and things of that sort. And I think we give too much credit to parents and churches and communities about telling us what's right and wrong. Too much. That's certainly important, vastly important, but it's not the whole picture.
It kind of is it can reinforce basic things, I think, or basic instincts.
Or override them.
Or override them.
Yeah, sure can.
But there's still a, common, I feel like there's a common instinct that overrides.
What common instinct particular?
Well, I grew up in church and everything, but I never believed it. That was just my own personal that wasn't what I was taught, but maybe,
So what is the instinct that made you not believe?
I don't, I'm not sure, I just never did, even from a real young age, like, it just doesn't make sense that this would be the one way to be,
Well, one of the explanations for that, and that's an experience for me and for a lot of other
Yeah,
people
for a lot of
too
people.
around here, it's not the dominant experience. 71% do accept what their parents told them. That's what one of the numbers I showed you up there. But one of the explanations for that is a sense of curiosity and a sense of wanting to weigh evidence. And you find this evidence, I saw one story where the young child, 10 years old, something like that, came home from Sunday school, and his mother asked him, well, how'd Sunday school go? Mom, you wouldn't believe it. They made the sea part. They walked on water. They flew up into the heavens. And he made up this whole story about about what that happening. He says, but I didn't believe any of it.
That would be me.
And,
That would be me.
yeah, several of us, I
Okay.
think.
Another, I don't know, nature versus nurture kind of thing. Our culture in the United States, at least, seems to be splitting up into two pieces. And one piece is the very tribal, if there's a way to split things up, we want to take it all, even if it is non-optimal for everybody. There's a culture that says we're not going to share. Doesn't matter if it would help everybody. And then there's another culture that says we can maximize the good for everyone if we cooperate. And it seems like there's an actual difference in the mental constitution of those two groups. The one group insists on evidence, the other group insists on making stuff up, and everybody agrees that, oh, that's a great idea, but we
I
don't have
actually
any
had
evidence.
a question, maybe not quite related to that, but would you say that the idea, if you say that morality is part of our genetics, and then we have these babies that need to be born looking more like the fathers, so that the father sees them as the in-group and has that experience of paternity, would you say that is a challenge to the idea that we're moral at heart if we do in fact still have that evolutionary trait of like, I'm not gonna love this thing unless we look alike?
The closest I can come to that is physical appearance. You can't put babies with their parents. There's been a lot of experiments that you cannot say this baby looks like the dad, this baby looks like, we believe it, but it ain't so.
Interesting.
So that's the first point that I'd make.
I
The
did
second,
not know that, so that kind of, I don't really have a question
Well,
anymore.
that's the second point that I would make about that is that the frequency of abuse of children is several factors higher with a parent that has not been the biological parent, but is a second marriage, an adopted parent, and so those cases where you have, especially the males, the frequency of abuse of the children in the family is way higher than it is if the most of the time presumed biological parents are raising the child.
Which reminds me of mother gorillas or maybe chimps having to protect the young from the father that sees them.
Yeah,
as like
that's
different.
true, but that's a different thing. In the same way that, the male lions, when they take over a pride, they'll eat the other children from their previous male.
But that feels
And
distinctive for you.
that's still what?
That feels distinctive for you. It feels like it's on the same page for me of like the in-group, out-group idea and this genetic inherent morality is like the
Well,
gorillas are eating
the
children.
out-group in this case would be the non-biological parent to the children.
Sure.
Mhm.
And in these
That would
cases
be.
where it is biological, it's
And
like,
most adoptive parents are really good parents, and don't let me taint everything. But some are
I
not.
I stepped out, you're talking to.
That's a different issue.
I'm kidding. No.
To Ed's point though, how much of it is education?
Well, that's environment. I'm putting education, I'm putting all of that over in the non-genetic. I'm just two boxes, genetic and non-genetic. And I would disagree with you on the phraseology that's so common, nature versus nurture. In my view, it's nature and nurture.
Okay.
And they interact mathematically in ways that is nonlinear oftentimes. So you need to take them both into account at the same time.
I guess my question was, could there be a genetic component to how the brain structure of the people in the
Yes,
say
but I don't believe
Republican versus
I don't believe
Democratic
that's
side?
true.
You don't think
I
that's
don't
true?
think that's true. I know I say, yeah, how can you be so dumb, you know, kind of thing. But I do not believe there's any good evidence that would suggest that MAGA people and progressive people have different brain structures, different things.
My
It's
parents
possible
were
they could, but I
progressive.
don't think there's any evidence for that I can point to.
I thought there was.
Yeah, I was about to
though.
say, I was thinking that there was a difference, particularly in the amygdala, which is the fear-based response, that particularly conservative people have a larger amygdala and therefore a higher fear response.
It could be. If you show me that the amygdala's changed, then I'm going to say, yeah, there's some evidence for it. But I haven't seen that.
Although whether it's the amygdala leads to the conservative behavior leads to a larger amygdala.
That's one of the problems with that kind of an analysis.
Right, it can be one way or the other, you know.
That's all right. We could do experiments and clop off a little piece.
Could you say something about common sense?
It's not very common.
A lot of people got shortchanged on common sense.
We use that phrase common sense almost always to say you're not agreeing with me. I see it this way, and if you had any common sense, you would agree with me. But
If you study physics, common sense just gets in the way of understanding.
well, the common sense is oftentimes mistaken. And one of the topics that I used in one of my critical thinking classes was to write a bunch of examples of where common sense would mislead you pretty badly about what goes on. But it's very useful. And I think that the way to think about common sense is, am I thinking they don't have any common sense because they don't agree with my view or not?
Yeah. Excellent.
Any thoughts on when morality directs people to sacrifice their reproductive fitness, as in martyrdom or voluntary celibacy?
I don't think that is genetically based. I think that is environmentally, that's where it's going to be almost all environmentally based, with the promise of a life hereafter and wonderful things it's going to have when you give that up. And it values an imagined afterlife over the actual life that's one being lived. And I don't see any evolutionary connection to that. Humans have always had superstitions of ghosts, and the trees are alive and have, all of that kind of stuff goes in there. But that particular case, I think that's almost entirely environmental. That's my view.
Makes sense.
That's a big self-sacrifice anyway, right? Because you're not really sacrificing your genetic code going forward or anything like that, because you believe that you're doing what somebody up in the sky has told you to do, and you're going to be rewarded eternally for that. So,
And most of those individuals, I would conjecture, are not interested in evolutionary biology or heritability or things of that sort. They don't think about it that way. And yeah, I know some of you have watched the Darwin Awards over the years, and there's some pretty good examples about those that don't contribute very much to the gene pool.
this has been very helpful for me. We're from the Southeast, and we're lots of people who think punitively around things like universal health care, social services. I had a conversation with my boss who said, Annalise, I don't know why you're happy with poor people going out and buying cigarettes with food stamps or whatever. And I was just like, because one person in that group is a good person who really needs help, and I would rather help that one person than punish everybody, right?
Yes.
And that's
Yes,
the way that I think.
that is the way it's often thought.
Good. Church going guy goes to church 3 days a week, all that sort of stuff.
Prayer
preaches
meeting
the
on
whole
Wednesday
thing,
night.
And I'm just like, I don't understand why you can't see things the way I see things.
They don't have any common
How can they
sense.
keep those two thoughts simultaneously in the same head?
But what you just went through here explained it to me why he was incapable of making that leap. It's not because he's stupid, it's not because of things, it's because of this genetic thing.
This selfishness gene, that's the one that evolution has solved. It's there.
Yeah,
It's there. And it works in a small situation with very few people genetically related. It works very badly in the situations where you're not very much genetically related. Yes, sir. I thought that was a...
No.
Yes, sir.
I have been a strong atheist and I believe in evolution since my first year in college. But I have all my friends and my relatives don't really understand all that. They don't want to accept it, even the educated ones. And they argue when we start to talk, they would always tell me or end the conversation by saying the world would have been a worse place if there was no religion in the world. And I tell them, no, because we have religion, we have the worst world now. We would have a better world if we didn't have religion. I strongly believe in that. But I can't really get a strong narrative to make my point. So I wonder if you would help me in that. How
Well, I can share some of this stuff that I've done, and I'll be glad to give it to you. And when I talk with people one-on-one, it takes a good long time. You can't do it in a minute or 2 minutes, but if you spend a half hour, 45 minutes, and go through a bunch of different examples, they will go away and think about it. They cannot, we as humans can't say, I was wrong on the spot. We have to go away and change our mind when nobody's watching and do it as a general pattern. And I'll be glad to share this. I mean, that's the reason I do this, is to hopefully give some little ammunition, because most of Americans now still do not believe evolution occurred at all, let alone had some effect on our morality or ethics.
Well, and just because you don't believe in religion does not mean you don't believe in ethics. So, you could argue with those people who say religion makes the world a better place. You could say, well, you don't need religion.
What about the Crusades? What
But
about
you might need ethical, considerations.
Yeah, that's what the dominant view is, that the world is a better place because of my religion, not their religion, my religion. Those Islamists have got it screwed up, but my Christian religion is correct and right.
And that's why we have to go out and have a war to get rid of all the people who feel differently.
Extermination.
Yeah.
Yeah, and while we're talking politics, I'm going to step over to the side here and give you my personal opinion that I think the media should be talking about Israel-Palestine as Jewishness and Islamist. That's a religious war, and it should use that language, in my opinion. Sorry, I'll quit now. Everybody give up?
What did you think of Coco telling a lie? The gorilla telling a lie in sign language. Did you hear about that one?
I did, and I was always a little suspicious about Coco, and I forget what the woman's name was so years that I was never quite convinced she was as linguistically capable as her handler said she was. And the reason I was a little bit is because it couldn't transfer. It was only between those two that all of the stories I read were about. That occasionally there would be some outside something and there would be a communication, but it was awfully minimal compared to the whole vocabulary that her handler claimed that she could read sign language.
I guess that the lie part kind of felt like it did add to the, she really is linguistically capable.
Yeah, and she might well have been. I know one of the patterns in biology is for years and decades we've underestimated the mental capabilities of almost all species, not just gorillas, but dolphins and whales and birds. We used to say bird brain is a pejorative. We now know birds are a hell of a lot smarter than we thought they were. Lots of really interesting patterns in the birds that show they can count and that they use tools. And most of you probably grew up where humans were the only ones that used tools. That's balderdash.
Well, that kind of speaks to you know, a movement towards veganism and vegetarianism.
That it could
As we
underlie
become
that
more
is
aware
right,
of
that's right.
Other animals,
Mhm.
mammals, awareness.
I think it
and
does.
I know I've become more sensitive to that over the last few years. I'm still not vegan, but closer than I
Aspiring.
used to
I'm
be.
sensitive to it.
Aspiring.
Yeah.
I'm not either, but I understand.
You wanna go away?
Thank you.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you, Mike.
Oh,
That
sure,
was
my
very
pleasure.
interesting.
Yeah.